We are now ready to see how this custom date time picker works. And we can do that by looking at the build method first. And as you can see, here we return a row with two input dropdowns inside expanded widgets. And the input dropdown is what we can use to show this UI with a label and some text with an underline and a down arrow to indicate that we can interact with this widget. And by the way, input dropdown is not part of the Flutter SDK. Instead, it is a custom widget that I have borrowed from the source code from the Flutter Gallery example app that ships with the Flutter SDK. And by the way, if you haven't seen the Flutter Gallery before, I recommend that you try this out because it shows how to use many of the widgets available in the Flutter SDK. And all you have to do to try this out is to open and run the Flutter Gallery project that is already bundled in the Flutter SDK. In any case, this is the input dropdown widget. And all it does is to show a text, an icon, and an underline effect with an input decorator. And it wraps all of this inside an inkwell widget that gives us this splash effect as well as the on-tap callback. And we pass this back to the DateTimePicker so that we can show the date and time pickers. By the way, you can see that I've used two expanded widgets with a flex of 5 and 4. And these values are used to decide which proportion of the horizontal space is allocated to their children inside the row widgets. But the interesting thing about these widgets is the onPressed callback. And we use this to call these selectDate and selectTime methods that are used to show a Flutter date picker and a time picker. And this is done with the showDatePicker and showTimePicker functions in the Flutter SDK. So if you wanted to find out more about how these work, you can read the documentation. But as far as we are concerned, we use these pickers to select date and time. And if these are different from the values that we have provided, then we call the onSelected date and onSelected time callbacks that we used in the entry page. So the date time picker and the input dropdown widgets are not particularly complex, but I think they illustrate quite well how we can build our own widgets in Flutter and how we can use composition to make something complex out of simple building blocks. And in the process of doing this, we compose widgets together by defining a layout in the build method. But we also decide how these widgets respond to input and pass data back to their parents with callbacks. In summary, the point that I'm trying to make is that there is nothing magical about building custom widgets in Flutter, and if we make them configurable enough, then we end up with reusable widgets that we can use elsewhere in our code. In fact, I think that the DateTimePicker and input dropdown widgets are generic enough that they shouldn't really live inside this job entries folder. And instead, we can move them over to this common widgets folder down here. So I'm going to move them like this. And this folder contains all widgets that are self-contained, which means that we can even move them to separate packages if we want to. So my recommendation is to always think about reusability when you build new features, because if you build your widgets well, then it becomes much easier to reuse them in the future. And personally, I'd much rather have some building blocks that I can reuse right away than having to do a refactor later on. Okay, so let's continue on the next video.